All right, now that we've taken a minute and looked at an overview of how to implement reflections in our applications using stencil buffers, we need to do it.
We need to implement it.
Let's go ahead and compile our little application. This is the one that we had after we finished the anti-aliasing lesson, where we can see this nice and smooth-looking cube. So we've got the anti-aliasing in place, and we're going to leave it, and we're just going to build onto this by adding in a floor. Joel, we don't have a floor.
No, we don't have a floor.
We got to have a floor.
We need a floor.
How are we going to reflect without a floor?
That's
what
problem.
I'm saying.
That's right.
Okay, so we need to add in the floor. We also need to go ahead and set up the stencil buffer. And then we need to basically control the modes. Are we just writing to it? Are we testing with it? What's going on?
Exactly. So let's go ahead and exit this out. Go to the very bottom here where we have our set attribute. Let me just go ahead and delete this out. Let me go ahead and add another set attribute. But in this case, what I want to do is change the stencil size. By default, it's just set to 0. So what I need to do is do an SDL GL stencil size.
And set it to 1.
And set that to 1.
I mean, we could leave it at 8, but it would be useless for us.
Right, we wouldn't really need it.
No. Waste of space.
Waste of space.
That's right.
So right now we have
that would be known as an 8-bit stencil buffer.
Yes, it would.
So
at this point, what we have is one texture.
And again, notice how he did that right there with the anti-aliasing setup as well. We're just making sure that that's done before we set the video.
Right.
That's the
and if you need to change that in some options inside of your program, you're going to need to recreate the window.
You're going to have to destroy the window first.
So I want 2 textures now, so I'm just going to change this over to text
2
floor.
textures. Man, you can never make you happy.
Nope. Just not satisfiable.
No, I know.
So a text box. I'm also going to create a constant GL float.
Okay.
That's going to store the height of our box, so box height. And we'll just set this to a default of 2.0.
Proud of you. You're actually using GL float this time.
Hey, thank you. So right here, I'm just going to copy and paste this because we need 2 textures at this point. One for the floor and one for the ground, if you will.
We'll just populate them into the new variables that you created above.
Yeah, so a ground and our surface.
And let's just change the word texture to text floor in the text box.
Yeah.
Nice.
And the text can be whatever.
Whatever name, you guys know, yeah.
Another thing we need to do is, up to this point, we've been clearing the depth buffer on every draw cycle.
Right.
We've also been clearing the frame buffer. Well, for our stencil buffer, we also need to clear that, but we need to set, well, we don't have to, but we can set the clear value that we want to clear it to.
Okay.
So every time we call GL clear with stencil buffer,
keeping things nice, clean, and easy to read.
Exactly. So what we're going to do is do a GL clear stencil, and we're going to pass
nice
it 0.
and clean. That's what we're doing here.
And we could have done that for our depth buffer this whole time.
Right.
So do a GL clear depth, and we'll set that to 1.0.
Right.
So every time we call GL clear, it's going to clear the stencil buffer to 0.
Right.
So at this point, let's go ahead and do our draw floor. So let me go down to...
Well, we've got a function right now that draws our box out, draw cube. So let's just add in a draw floor.
Yep. And we've done something similar to this before, many times actually. So I'm not going to dwell on it too much. I'm going to create a constant GL float. I'll just call this size. This is going to be the size of the plane. Of course, you could pass this as a parameter to draw floor.
If you wanted to be a little bit more flexible.
Right. In this case, we'll just do a GL texture 2D and pass it to floor text ID. And actually, before I forget, let me go up to draw cube and change this over to box tech, or text box. Text box, there it is. And down here, let me go ahead and do a GL begin. We're going to just draw some quad.
Just a quad.
Just one quad.
Right.
Well, I don't know what I'm doing there. So something like that. And then inside of here, we do want lighting information, so we'll do a GL normal. But since it's on a plane, we just need to call it once. And
it's pointing upwards, so we'll just set 1 to Y.
Y to 1.
Y to 1 and 1 to Y.
We also need texture coordinates.
Dyslexic.
So GL text cord 2F, 0.0F, and 1.0F. GL vertex 3F, and we're going to pass it negative size, 0.0, and size. And let me just go ahead and copy and paste this a few times. Something like that. And then let me just go ahead and switch these around. So this is going to be 0.0,
0, 1, 0, and 1, 1.
Oops. 1.0F, and this one's going to be 0, 0, and then 1, 1.
Okay.
And then for here, this is going to be negative size and negative size. This is going to be size and negative size.
And then size, both positive.
So there we have that. So let me go ahead and clear that out. And for the GL clear, real quick here, I'm going to make it clear the stencil buffer bit as well.
And notice he's now starting to affect the draw scene function.
Yes. Now is time to draw it out.
Sneak into it.
I failed. Buffer bet. So right after I draw my cube, I'm going ahead and draw the floor as well, just to make sure our function is, working properly.
Well, yeah.
So as you can see, we now have our almighty cube and our little floor.
Yeah. We just need to take our almighty cube and push it up some.
All right. So our almighty cube is going to go up a little bit. So do a translate F, and 0.0 F. We'll do a box height and 0.0 F.
Let us see.
Oh, well, let's do the draw floor right before so we don't mess that up.
Yeah. Because remember, it's a state machine.
That's right.
Hey, look at that. All right.
So now the goal
Now make it reflective.
Yes, that is the goal. So that's what I'm going to be doing, is making it reflective. So the first thing, if I just go over into our PowerPoint slideshow real quick here, remember the first thing we need to do is draw the mask. Again, this is not going to appear on the frame buffer. This is just what's going to appear on the stencil buffer.
Right.
So the first thing we need to do is enable testing of our stencil buffer and start throwing stuff in there. So if I come right down to here, let me go ahead and do a GL enable, GL stencil test. And then what I need to do is another thing. When we're drawing to the stencil buffer, we don't want to be drawing to the frame buffer, right?
That's
We're using the same calls, GL begin, we're going to call draw floor, draw cube, and so on. We need to turn off.
We could end up drawing to both.
Yes, we could.
That's not good because remember, you see what's in the frame buffer.
That's right. So what we need to do is we're going to introduce a new function call called GL color mask. And this allows us to set whether or not RGB and alpha components are going to get drawn to the screen or not, to the frame buffer.
So setting it to 1111 means everything's going to get drawn to the frame buffer. Setting them to all 0 means none of those elements will be drawn.
Precisely.
Meaning we're no longer drawing to the frame buffer.
So after we're done with this whole schmoll, we're going to turn this back over to 1111. And then we're going to start drawing to it again. And then, of course, we need to enable stencil testing. And as we talked about before, we have a stencil func and a stencil op. So for the stencil function, we don't want to take into account the stencil function.
We don't want to use the stencil buffer for its checking ability at the moment.
We're just populating it.
We just want to write to it.
Exactly. So we'll set this to GL always, which means we'll always draw no matter what.
That's right.
And
which means that when we go to draw in a minute, we're not going to draw our cube.
No.
Because we always draw, everything gets drawn to it. All we need to draw is just our floor. And since the stencil buffer is a 1-bit buffer, all it holds is 0 and 1. The floor is just going to be represented with a bunch of 1s.
Right.
There's our mask.
Exactly. So we'll set that, and we also need our stencil op. There we go. And inside of here, we have basically 3 events that can happen depending on whether or not we want to populate the stencil buffer. In this case, we want to draw to it on the Z pass. Notice we have fail, and Z pass. So each of these can be set to GL keep, GL replace, etc. I'll set the first 2 to GL keep, and Z pass, I'll just set this to GL replace. So this means anytime I draw something to it and this passes, I'm going to replace whatever's in the stencil buffer with what I just drew to it.
With the reference value.
Exactly.
Which is 1.
Which is 1. So at this point,
Which is right there.
Exactly.
For those that can't see my finger.
Right here. Yeah.
Thank you.
So what I'm going to do now is go ahead and draw the floor. But I'm also going to disable depth testing. So do a disable GL depth test.
Just so the depth test plays no part in when we start drawing things.
Right. The stencil buffer should be a separate process altogether. It shouldn't be worrying about the depth buffer. Or at least not in our case. So then we draw our floor. And at the very end, we need to actually...
We need to start, drawing back to the... you've got the... we're drawing back to the frame buffer.
We got the frame buffer. And now what we need to do is draw the cube, but start taking into account the stencil buffer.
That's right. But stop. Go back over to your PowerPoint presentation. All right, we've done bottom left one. That's what we just accomplished.
Right.
So now what we need to do is this right here, this top picture there.
Right, we need to draw this one here.
Which means now we're going to need to transform our cube.
Our cube.
We're going to need to scale it -1 and Y.
Right. But which also means we're going to need to store our transformations so that we can restore them later.
That's right.
So if we come back over into here, let's go ahead and do a GL push matrix. And let's actually set our matrix mode real quick here. So our matrix mode is going to be set to GL model view. And then what we need to do...
a little scaling action.
GL scale.
Very important. Please make sure that your X and Z values are scaled at 1. If you scale them at 0,
you're not going to
you will not have a cube.
Yes, I've made that mistake before.
And it's fun to laugh at Joel when he does it.
Yes, it is.
Where'd my cube go? Where'd my cube go?
So let's go ahead and pop the matrix back again.
Obviously, otherwise everything's going to always be drawn.
Yeah, no kidding.
Mirrored.
And then what we need to do is actually draw our cube. Well, we need to translate it as well. So let me take this box height translation here, put it right after the scale, and then draw our cube. So let's do a draw cube. And, of course, right now, we still have the same GL Stencil Func and GL Stencil Op that we had before. We need to change this around a bit. We don't want to be replacing the stencil buffer anymore, and we want to start thinking about the stencil buffer. We don't want to say GL always.
Right.
So right here, right inside of this area here, what I'm going to do is do a GL Stencil Func and do a GL equal instead, and with 1 and 1. So when it's equal to 1, go ahead and draw it. And the GL Stencil Op, I'm going to make all of these GL keep, which simply means don't modify the stencil buffer at all.
Right.
And when I'm done with this, I'm going to go ahead and disable the stencil buffer at the very end because I'm not going to be using it anymore. So just do a GL disable stencil test. So right after the draw cube, go ahead and disable the stencil testing. Does that look right to you?
Mm-hmm.
So let me
we got some lighting issues in there that we need to worry about as well.
Yeah, I'll address that in just 1 second. Let me see if this works at all first. Dun dun. Okay, check this out. When I'm looking underneath it, I'm actually seeing the stencil buffer, but the floor is blocking it. Let me go ahead and not stop drawing the floor for a real quick second here.
Okay.
So let me disable this, and let me disable this second draw cube. So all I'm doing is drawing the stencil buffer, and I'm drawing the cube that's being reflected.
Cube, right.
So if I run that right now, you can see this cube here, and watch this. As I move up, notice it's getting clipped by some invisible plane here.
Right, which is our mask.
Which is our mask. So that's where we're going to draw it on top. Also, our cube is getting blended at the moment, so let's go ahead and disable blending. So let's do a GL disable, GL blend, just kind of walking you through every single step of the process so you know exactly what's going on here. If I run this...
So nice solid, and then, of course, clip.
And clipping.
Very good.
So if I just go back into my PowerPoint real quick here, we have done this step here. Now what we need to do is draw the reflected object. But before I do that, let me get the lighting into place as well. So let me take this update lights here. And remember, any transformations that we do with lights, we need to take that, any transformations we do to our scene, our model view matrix, our lights need to be updated to reflect that. So what we're going to do is after our scale F, we're going to update our lights. And then after we do our pop matrix, update our lights again, just so that everything is properly in place. So at this point, we have blending enabled. We need to go ahead and draw our floor. But our floor needs to be a little bit transparent. So what we can do is do a GL color for F and simply pass it 1.0F, 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 and simply pass it 0.8F. So the floor is slightly transparent.
Right.
And let me go ahead and compile this. Render this out, and check it out. As I zoom out, there's something underneath, and as I move it up, pretty cool. So let me go ahead, one final step.
Almost there.
Draw the cube.
Huh. Ding, ding.
Ooh. So as you can see, as I move down...
Our cube is slightly transparent.
Oh, our cube is transparent. Oh, it's still at 0.8. So what I'm going to do is simply set this to 1, which would work. Simply set this to be opaque.
Nice.
And there you go.
Look at that.
And something that's really interesting, notice if I do this, I can still see the cube as we saw before. But
how many games do you have where you run around up underneath the floor?
Exactly. That's something that you're going to have to take into account. I mean,
you can simply lock the navigation to where a person couldn't rotate under there if you needed to.
Exactly. And that's what a lot of people will do. So just prevent this from happening. But just be aware of this problem, if you will. So once you understand that this is happening, you'll know how to fix it, either by limiting what the user can see or whatever.
Or there's other methods as well, just for controlling it not being
exactly
there. So you just got to think out the logic for it. But anyways, here we go. We've got some reflectivity going on. Looks very nice, Joel. You did a fantastic job. It's very fast as well, and it's anti-aliased, which I really appreciate.
Anti-aliasing is nice.
And that's pretty much all there is to it. Again, the stencil buffer plays a very important role. Again, the argument arguments can seem a bit confusing at first, especially with the multiple tests that get done.
That's right.
Just head on over to the help file, do a little bit of reading. It never hurts,
right.
just to kind of strengthen your knowledge about what's going on.
And actually, before we end up, we mentioned that we're going to change the reflectivity a little bit.
Yeah,
so let me go ahead and do that.
Things? Yeah.
Another thing is, what happens if I switch over into my PowerPoint here. Actually, let me exit this out. Switch over into my PowerPoint. Remember we said our mask was like this, and we said that we used our stencil func to decide how we're testing this. So if I change my reference over to 0, that means wherever it's 0 or black, I'm going to be drawing to it. So if I go back over to here, and right in my GL equal here, if I change this reference over to a 0, it's going to draw where it's 0. So it's going to flip where I'm going to draw stuff. So check this out. Notice, no more reflection, just gone.
Right.
Look at that. It is now wherever the plane is not.
Exactly.
So I hope that helps a little bit to kind of push home how this stencil buffer is working. And also, let me go ahead and switch that back and change the reflectivity of this plane by maybe changing this to a 50% transparency. Running this, and check it out.
Ooh.
It looks like it's more transparent.
Yeah, it does.
And another thing, that this is making a little bit darker, as you might notice here. And one reason for that is because the background here we have is black, so it's blending into black. One thing you could do is draw, right before you draw all of this, draw in this area right here where the reflective object is, draw a white plane. And then after everything gets blended on, you're going to have the same thing. And that will help with the problem of if you have multiple floors and you don't want to see what's underneath, you would have that plane on the reflective objects, which would prevent you from seeing anything below it.
Precisely. Awesome, man. This is really good stuff.
Yeah.
All right, so with that, that's pretty much going to wrap this video up on how to use stencil buffers to add reflections into your applications. Thanks a lot, everyone.